Well, it's so good to have all of you with us today. My name is Chris, and we're in part 5 of the series, Unshakable. And maybe you're connecting with us for the very first time today, or maybe you've missed some weeks, or maybe, you just want to go back and watch. And I just want to encourage you, we've made this entire series available to you at tcconline.tv/unshakable. And maybe, just maybe, you've heard something across this series, or maybe today, and you just know a friend of yours needs to hear this. Again, a simple text with this link, or a DM, or an email, or a message, or a phone call to say, hey, here, you'll watch this. You never know how God wants to use you in a friend's life to help them as they're facing a season of uncertainty. Well, today in part 5, I wanted to give the framework, kind of the direction of where we're going in this part of the series. I'm going to start by sharing some insights that starts to tie in this entire, not just series, but this entire story of Daniel. And then I'm going to share another part of the story of Daniel. Maybe you have heard this story before. I love this story of Daniel. And then I'm going to share with you some very specific actions that will help, encourage, and give some direction on how to have unwavering faith. So let's just jump into, some insights. The tagline for this series is how to have unwavering faith as we live in uncertain times. And we have global uncertainty, we have local uncertainty, political uncertainty. Maybe for you, there's a lot of personal uncertainty, financial uncertainty, or job uncertainty, or maybe it's relationship uncertainty, whether it's marriage or parenting or with a friend. We all have uncertainty just swirling all around us. And here's what's incredible. The Bible gives us such an incredible framework of how to face uncertainty in our life and will have unwavering faith. And that's why we're making our way through the story of Daniel. And in part 1, in chapter 1, we step into this storyline. And King Nebuchadnezzar lays siege to Jerusalem. He actually enslaves a bunch of young Jewish boys, Daniel being one of them, and 3 of Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And right from the very beginning, when we step into this storyline, we see Daniel's resolve. His resolve to remain faithful to God. Then we journeyed into part 2 of this series, and all of a sudden, King Nebuchadnezzar, orders this kill all the wise men order, all of them. But Daniel, what does he do? He goes to the king, he's like, hey, king, give me some time. And what was Daniel's go-to action? It was to pray. In fact, he begs God. It was Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They begged God. They didn't want to die. And as they prayed to God that night, God gave Daniel wisdom, insight, so he could go to the king and tell the king his dream, which saved his life, his friend's life, and all the wise men's life. Then we moved on to, this next part of the story, and the king Nebuchadnezzar commands that everyone worship this golden idol, but Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they said, no, we're not going to. They placed all of their trust in God. They literally looked at the king and said, hey, king, our God is able to save us from the fiery furnace, but even if he does not, because their trust was in who God is, not what God was going to do. And that led into part 5 of the series, that all of a sudden we looked at these 2 different kings who had 2 different visions, 2 different dreams. And the first one was King Nebuchadnezzar, and he has this dream, and both of these dreams were all about pride. And Daniel pauses. The Aramaic word was he was perplexed. He was stupefied. Why? Because he realized the gravity of what he was going to have to say to the king. He was going to have to look at the king in the eyes and share with him some direct truth. And as he paused, God gave him courage to speak truth in love, to speak directly with honor to the king, to say, hey, king, You better listen to my advice. You better humble yourself. What's interesting is when King Belshazzar has a vision, you don't see Daniel perplexed, stupefied. You don't see him pausing. He directly looks at the king with courage. Why? Because, faith is like a muscle. The more you work it out, the more you stretch it, the stronger it becomes. And all of a sudden, Daniel just looks at King Belshazzar in the eyes and shares with him about the one true sovereign God. And all of that leads to where we're going today, this next part of the story. And again, the king is going to do, what kings do, and Daniel is going to, embrace, reflect another important part of having unwavering faith. So those are some insights, and that leads to, the next portion of part 5, and that's the story. Where we're going to step into the story is where we ended last week. At the very end of last week, we're told that Belshazzar, the Babylonian king, co-regent king, was slain. He was killed. And that Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. Now, a couple of insights, because at the very end of chapter 6, we're introduced not just to Darius the Mede, but also King Cyrus. And it can get a little confusing, like, who's king? Well, King Cyrus was the one that conquered. He was a Persian king that conquered Babylon. And most scholars just believe that Darius became the viceroy over Babylon. Babylon was this massive territory. In fact, when the Medo-Persian Empire came to power, to be the world power, it was the largest world power ever to be known. I mean, it was a gigantic territory. So think of Darius as more of a viceroy, but King Cyrus was the king of the Medo-Persian Empire. And so all of a sudden, Daniel finds himself now living under not just a new king, but now a new empire that had just conquered the Babylonians. And this is what we're told. Now, Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Now, I want to pause there because I don't want to lose this kind of side thought. Have you ever thought to yourself, if I had a better boss? Have you ever thought to yourself, if I had a better CEO or a better manager or a better vice president, or if I had your work situation. If only I'd give more. I would work harder. I would put forth more effort. It's so easy to start making excuses of why we don't give our best. And what we have to see, and then Daniel models this for us, it has nothing to do with who the king is. I mean, Daniel's in his 80s now, and he has served multiple kings. And over again, we see Daniel giving his best as he's still enslaved in this pagan culture. But he gives his best. Why? Because Daniel understands something. His work ethic, how he's been created, his unique qualities, his character, isn't tethered to whoever's above him. It's tethered to God. That him giving his best is actually honoring and a form of worship to God. That when you give your best, when you work hard, when you realize that how you've been created and you want to honor God and worship God in those creative uniquenesses, that's just you. It has nothing to do with who's over you positionally. It has everything to do with, hey, God, I want to honor you by giving my best. Hey, God, I want to worship you by giving my best. And Daniel, over and over again, models this. And yet again, a new empire, a new king, and he so distinguishes himself. Why? Because he was giving not the king his best, not Darius his best. No, he was giving God his best. He was honoring God. He was worshiping God by giving his best. And we're told that at this, the administrators and the satraps try to find grounds for charges against Daniel. in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Now, again, envy just rose within these other government officials, and they came after Daniel. But here's the thing. When you give your best, when you give your all, not for the glory and pleasure of people around you, but for God, people just couldn't find any cracks in his armor. Why? Because he was trustworthy. He was a man of his word. He was a man of character. He gave his all. They watched him. They're like, oh, there's nothing we can complain about with how he's doing his job. So finally, we're told that these men said, well, we will never find any basis for charges against this man, Daniel, unless it has something to do with the law of his God. Now, this is what they were after. They're like, okay, obviously his work ethic, obviously his skill set. This guy every day is bringing it. They're like, the only chink possibly in his armor, they connected to obedience. And they said, he's either going to obey the law of his God or obey the law of his king. He can't do both. Like you can almost feel this moment where all of a sudden someone in that group think circle said, light bulb moment, I got it. I know how we can trap him. And they just knew, because at this point they had realized Daniel's faith connected to the one true sovereign God. So we're told that these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king and said, may King Darius live forever. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed. Now, another important insight is Daniel at this point is, his position was like prime minister. He was, right next to Darius in leadership. Darius had promoted him right to kind of his right arm. And so when they said we all agreed, Darius must have just assumed that Daniel was part of, all the rest of the leaders. Why? Because Daniel was their boss. And they're like, hey, we've all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days. Now, 30 days is a really important insight, so just hold on to 30 days. Except you, your majesty, and here's the consequence, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Okay, this edict, this decree wasn't forever, just 30 days, and the consequence was death. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it into writing so that it cannot be altered in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. Part of the Medo-Persian kind of governmental structures, once a decree was made, it was in stone. It couldn't be repealed. So, King Darius put the decree in writing. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, right, that's now official, what did Daniel do? Well, we're told he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. And 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to God, just as he had done before. 3 times a day, consistently, constantly praying that he had been doing daily. And don't you think these other envious government officials knew exactly his daily rhythm? Of course they did. Of course they did. Especially lunchtime, as Daniel dismissed himself to go home to pray. They all knew Daniel's obedience to his God. But what's interesting to me is we're told that when he went to pray, knowing that this decree was official, knowing that the consequence to this decree was death, what does Daniel do? We're told he gives thanks. Gratitude erupted in another season of grave uncertainty to Daniel, in another moment where his life was being attacked. Gratitude erupted from within him as he looked towards Jerusalem. And then these men went as a group and found Daniel. They all knew what he did 3 times a day, and they found him praying and I love this insight, asking God for help. They were like, Daniel was praying to his God, giving him things, and, Daniel was just being real. He's like, God, I need you now. There's an official decree. Darius just made the decree. Anyone who prays for the next 30 days, except for him, is going to die. And Daniel, again, like he had done over and over and over again, going to God on his knees in prayer, saying, God, I need you now. God, your will be done. Whatever that looks like, I'm going to follow you. And when these government officials see Daniel praying, they get excited. They're like, Daniel is guilty as charged. They got him. He's breaking the king's decree. And so they rush to the king to tell the king what they caught Daniel doing. And we're told that when the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. But he was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. The king was trying to find a way out of his own decree. The king realized what he had been tricked into doing, what he had been trapped into doing. He realized that Daniel wasn't part of the original idea, that these other government officials had excluded Daniel because they wanted Daniel dead. But this group of government officials looked at the king and they said, hey, remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. They got the king and they got Daniel. So the king gave the order. And they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve, continually rescue you. And then a stone was brought, placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. He had to do what he had to do to ensure Daniel's death. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. King Darius was just besides himself. Why? Because the amount of respect that he had for Daniel and what he realized he was tricked into doing. At the first light, we're told, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice. It's like he was just hoping. He probably thought there was almost no chance, but he was hoping beyond hope that just maybe Daniel was alive. And he screamed out with an anguished voice, hey, Daniel, servant of the living God, had your God whom you serve continually been able to rescue you from the lions? And I think he paused. It felt like forever. It's probably like a millisecond, but he just paused and was like just hoping to hear a voice. And all of a sudden Daniel answered, may the king live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done anything wrong before you, your majesty. And the king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him. Why? Because he had trusted in God. Over and over again, you see this theme of trust. In moments of grave uncertainty, trusting in not what God will do, but who God is. Well, the story goes on, and Darius literally puts to death not just those satraps and government officials, but their wives and their children. It was horrible. He threw them all in the lion's den, and then he makes a new decree. And this was his new decree. May you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and have reverence for the God of Daniel. For he is a living God. And he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. And he has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. And so this part of the story comes to the end, and we're told, so Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. In fact, it was Cyrus that freed the Jewish Babylonian prisoners. It was Cyrus who allowed them to go back home if they wanted to. And it was Cyrus that gave the okay for the remaining Jews to rebuild the temple that Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed. You see, we look at these insights from the book of Daniel, and we think about what we just looked at today. The king orders another decree. Only worship him. And what does Daniel choose to do? Obey God and not the king's decree. And all of this is going to lead to part 6, the final part of this series. And something very interesting happens, especially on this kind of line of unwavering faith as we live on in uncertain times. But we'll get to that moment next week. So, we've looked at some insights connected to this whole series. We looked at another part of the story, and all of that leads to, well, a few remaining action points that I just want to share with you to encourage you, maybe create a little tension within you, maybe it will help you work. Remember, faith is a muscle. The more you stretch it, the more you work it out, the more you live your faith, the stronger it gets. And so you start to face, no matter what comes your way, no matter what uncertainty, your faith can become unwavering. And we see that in the life of Daniel. One of the things I want to encourage you with is this. Obedience grows faith. Daniel had a choice. And here's what I love about this choice. It was only 30 days. It wasn't forever. The edict, the decree wasn't forever. It wasn't like, hey, you can never worship or pray to God again. It was only for 30 days. And it would be so easy for any of us to just rationalize that away. Oh, it's only 30 days. God will get it. God's okay with it. I'm just going to do this thing so that I can live longer, right? And here's what we do with obedience. It's so easy for us to just rationalize away our own obedience to God. I mean, God gives very specific direction in the Bible of how to live. And think about the number of times where I'm guilty of this, right? We just start to rationalize away our obedience. We're like, well, did God really mean that? Did God really say that? Does that apply now? That was so long ago, but it can't apply to this day, can it? Well, just this one time. God will understand. His grace will cover me. God loves me. Just this one time and next time. But other than that, God, you understand, God. It's a gray area. And ultimately, what God is after is our obedience. And it's in obedience in the big moments and in the small moments that grows our faith. That's why I think it's so fascinating that this was only 30 days. Daniel could have quickly rationalized away, going, it's 30 days. Okay, I'm going to just, it's new king, it's a new governing power. I've already been promoted. Hey, God, 30 days. God, I'm not going to really pray to this king. No, God, I'm still connected to you. I'm just going to do this. Why? Because my influence in the kingdom, just give me 30 days and then everything will shake out. And Daniel's like, no, I'm not. I'm not going to rationalize away my faith. God, I'm going to stay obedient to you. What are you playing games with when it comes to obedience to God? What games are you playing? What things are you just kind of trying to dismiss? And you just know because God is saying, no. Obey. Follow. Here's the guardrails. This is how I expect you to live. My encouragement for you is just obey. Just obey. And watch your faith get strengthened. Another action, you got to shift your focus. What did Daniel do right when he got to his room? He looked towards Jerusalem. Now, this is really important. The temple had been destroyed decades before by Nebuchadnezzar. So the temple, the place where God dwelled during the ancient Hebrew times, it was gone. But it was a symbol for Daniel. As he walked up his stairs in Babylon, he shifted his eyes as a symbol, to the place where God dwelled. It was him, like when we say to look up to heaven. And here's the thing, as we live in uncertain times, there's so many people and things and newspaper and headlines and social media posts that are all trying to shift our focus off of God. And I love the action that Daniel immediately walks to his room and he shifts his focus to God. He's like, God, I'm just going to stare at you. And my encouragement for all of us is what are we spending more time focused on? Are we focused on the election? Are we focused on the headlines? Are we focused on the uncertainty in the world? Are we focused on the uncertainty of our finances? Are we focused on the uncertainty of everything around us? Or are we focused in on God? Maybe for you, you need to just shift your focus, to shift your eyes on God. God who is present with you, walking with you, no matter how intense the uncertainty is. Another action, prayer, is a source of God's provision. We see this throughout the story of Daniel. There was prayer, and through prayer, God provided. Through prayer, courage soared within Daniel because he prayed. Insight came to Daniel out of prayer. Wisdom came to Daniel out of prayer. A strength came to Daniel out of prayer. God's presence was made known out of prayer. Over and over again, God's provision was sourced to Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego through prayer. Is prayer a constant and consistent part of your life? Is that your go-to faith-stretching, faith-strengthening action in your spiritual journey right now? If not, make a commitment right now to say, hey, God, first thing, I'm going to pray. Last thing in the day, I'm going to pray. God, my conversation with you is going to be the source of my provision. That God, I'm going to rely on your voice and your presence to give me what I need to get through the uncertainty I'm facing right now. The next action, gratitude, is tethered to who, not what. Remember, so many times we want to tether gratitude to something good going on in our life. And over again, Daniel, his life is being threatened. And what does he do? He gives thanks. Now, he also asked God for help. True. But his first step in prayer was to give God thanks, to give gratitude to God for all that God has done in his life for him. You see, when you pray, my encouragement for you is start with what God is doing in your life, the good things that God is up to, how you see God moving within you and other people's lives, to give God praise, to give God thanks, because he's a good God. He's a generous God. He keeps giving to us and keeps giving to us. And that step to pray, to talk with God, to give him gratitude, say, God, thank you. I see what you are up to, and I'm blown away. Thank you, God. You see, gratitude has nothing to do with what is going on around us, the uncertainty going on around us. It has everything to do with who God is. And then, the last action, you got to trust in the valley. God allowed Daniel to be thrown in the lion's den. Just like he allowed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to be thrown in the fiery furnace. Just like God allowed them to be enslaved as Jewish young boys, to be taken, kidnapped, and forced into Babylon. And you see, faith grows and strengthens when we trust God walking in the valley. And for some of you, you're in the valley right now. And I want to encourage you, trust God. Because it's when you trust God that God shows himself to be present. When God shows himself to be your peace. When he shows himself to be what you need. When he whispers to you, I got you. And that's why you got to shift your eyes to him no matter what's going on around you. To say, God, I'm going to stare at you because I'm trusting that you're walking with me in the valley. We worship and follow a good God that has promised to give us everything we need to get us through the day. So let's obey. Let's follow. Let's shift our eyes. Let's give him thanks. Let's place our gratitude focused at him. Let's trust him, knowing that he's all that we need. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you for the encouragement on how to stretch and strengthen our faith. I thank you for the direction that Daniel has given us just by how he has lived his life as he lived in uncertain times, and we get to see his unwavering faith. And Lord, I just pray that we put these things into action to strengthen our faith, to stretch our faith, knowing that, God, you are a good God who walks with us. In your name I pray.